This export control reform hearing will come to order. Today we meet to discuss the agenda for advancing U.S. export control reform. The U.S. has long had in place a system of strategic export controls. These controls restrict the commercial export of both arms and dual-use items, that is, items that have both a civilian and military application, in order to advance our national security, our foreign policy, and of course our economic interests around the globe. The main goal of our export controls is to restrict the flow of sensitive technology to terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism or other countries that may be hostile to the United States. Under this system, the State Department is responsible for regulating arms exports, while the Commerce Department is responsible for regulating exports of dual-use items. The Department of Defense identifies and helps protect military critical technologies, including by providing technological expertise. Several agencies, including the Departments of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, are responsible for the enforcement. This committee has jurisdiction over all aspects of U.S. strategic export controls, and for many years this system has been regarded as the gold standard of national export control regimes. But over time, the GAO and many others have observed that the complexities of the system have begun to erode its own effectiveness. In particular, the nature of our controls became out of step with changes in defense acquisition policy, global manufacturing trends, and technological development. The world economy left our bureaucracy behind. As we will hear today, the administration has begun a comprehensive restructuring of U.S. export control system. The goal of that reform effort is to better tailor U.S. export controls to our national security interests. These interests include helping our industry shed needless bureaucracy and compete in the global marketplace and strengthening our economy. Indeed, this reform will affect a broad swath of American business, including the defense industry, aerospace, the commercial satellite and space industry, electronics, semiconductors, and communications technology. The goal is a more transparent and a more efficient system. However, some caveats are in order. The primary beneficiaries of the current reforms are expected to be small and medium-sized industries, but they and others initially may struggle to adapt to the intricacies of a new regulatory regime. Likewise, it is uncertain whether executive branch agencies themselves are fully prepared for these changes, both with respect to licensing and enforcement functions. Effective outreach to business will be critical. Missteps in implementation are inevitable. The committee will be watching and lend a hand when we can. Meanwhile, there is a large reform agenda still ahead. More effort should be placed on enhancing licensed defense trade with friends and allies. Implementation of multilateral regime changes should be accelerated. The increasingly elaborate export administration regulations need to be simplified. Some of these goals can be accomplished by the executive branch, but Congress also has an important role to play here. And in this regard, I look forward to working with the ranking member on bipartisan legislation to advance common sense reforms. As with the historic reforms of U.S. satellite controls that passed Congress last year, we hope to cooperate closely on these matters with the executive branch. Here I would suggest it is long past due to reassess the status of the last Export Administration Act. Let's ensure that we are guarding against those enemies that are determined to hurt us with our own technology. And I turn now to the ranking member for his opening statement. Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, it's like old times. For 6 years, we were the ranking member and chair of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee. We held 5 hearings on this issue, and I want to commend you for bringing this issue early in your first year as chair of this committee to the full committee. We've got 2 statutory regimes, arms sales regulated by the State Department, which creates the munitions list, dual-use items regulated by the Department of Commerce, which both by the nature of the the nature of the items it regulates and its own proclivities is somewhat less stringent. In late 2006, the State Department had a backlog of 10,000 license applications. Waiting times went for months, even exporting handguns to be used by police officers in the most friendly countries could take months. Delays in the adjudication are often just as bad as answering with a no, because in either case, the business will go elsewhere. The effect of that is not only lost jobs in the United States, but also money flowing into the industrial base of countries that may be less stringent or even unfriendly to the United States. Manufacturers have viewed being on the munitions list as a great difficulty, leading to the so-called ITAR-free satellites carefully constructed so not a single part would be subject to the international traffic and arms regulations of the State Department. I look forward to satellites being moved to the dual-use list with some additional restrictions. Our subcommittee held 6 hearings on this. I want to commend especially the State Department for allocating additional resources and shortening the wait times. The Obama administration has announced the outlines of export control reform. Secretary Gates was right when he said we need to build a higher fence around a smaller yard, and I would add, with a faster gatekeeper. The President's Export Reform Initiative will make a number of improvements to the system, including an enforcement coordinator to coordinate commerce and state, IT improvements to allow easier submission and processing applications, and a single electronically available list of prescribed entities ineligible for exports, which has been made available. The focus here is to look category by category at items on the munitions list and determine what items in that category can be transferred to a new Commerce Department munitions list. Referred to as the Series 600. And so you have a State Department list that is getting smaller and a Commerce Department list that is getting larger. We need to reauthorize the statute for the Commerce Department, the Export Administration Act. Right now it's being continued on life support under the General Emergency Statute, IEPA. It's about time Congress actually craft legislation in this area rather than keeping alive ancient legislation or letting the administration do so. We need to carefully look at the export control reform, perhaps move toward a single agency rather than just coordination between 2 agencies. Finally, I want to emphasize that it is in our interest to be exporting not goods, but to export tools and dies and blueprints. The effect of that is not only that we lose jobs, but that we build a arms or dual-use infrastructure elsewhere. And I think it should be an explicit part of our policy that we are not here to liberalize the rules to offshore production, even if there are powerful interests in this area that would find that the profitable thing to do. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how we can make sure that the infrastructure and the manufacturing infrastructure stays here in the United States, and that there are not undue delays in exporting that which should be exported. I yield back.
Well put. We'll go to our representatives now from the Departments of State, Commerce, and Defense. We'll start with Mr. Thomas Kelly, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs of the State Department. In his career as a Foreign Service officer, he has served in posts across the continent of Europe and in South America. Mr. Kevin Wolf serves as Assistant Secretary for Export Administration for the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce, and prior to this appointment, he practiced law specializing in export administration regulations and international traffic and arms regulations. And we have Mr. James Hirsch, Director of the Defense Technology Security Administration for the Defense Department. His career at the Department began 28 years ago. He's been awarded the Secretary of Defense Exceptional Service Award. We are welcoming here all our witnesses to the committee, and without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members may have 5 days to submit statements and questions and extraneous material for the record. So I would ask that you all summarize your prepared statement, and we'll start with Mr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Thanks to you and to Congressman Sherman for your remarks. Chairman Royce, Congressman Sherman, committee members, it's been 2 years since the committee last met to hear testimony on the President's Export Control Reform Initiative. A lot of work has been done in the intervening period. I'd like to start by thanking the committee on behalf of the State Department for its bipartisan support throughout this process. As the pace of technological advance accelerates and as technological capability spreads around the world, the need to update our export controls is increasingly urgent. We're no longer in an era in which a handful of countries hold the keys to the most sensitive technologies, as was the case during the Cold War. Today, a whole range of nations have advanced technological capability. At the same time, because of the diffusion of technology, many U.S. companies must collaborate with foreign partners to develop, produce, and sustain leading-edge military hardware and technology, and their survival depends on it. But because our current export controls are confusing, time-consuming, and many would say overreaching, our allies increasingly seek to design out U.S. parts and services, thus avoiding our export controls and the end-use monitoring that comes with them in favor of indigenous design. This threatens the viability of our defense industrial base, especially in these austere times. Our current system has another problem. It can prevent our allies in theater from getting the equipment and technology they need to fight effectively alongside our troops in the field. The system has its basis in the 1960s and hasn't undergone significant updates since the early 1990s. It's cumbersome, complex, and incorrectly controls too many items as though they were crown jewel technologies. And what that's meant is that there's been an inordinate amount of agency resources, both in terms of licensing and compliance activities, that have been expended on nuts and bolts as well as our real crown jewel technologies. In November 2009, President Obama directed a White House task force to identify how to modernize our export control system so that it will address the current threats that we face, as well as account for the technological and economic landscape of the 21st century. His direction was grounded in national security, with the goal of putting up higher fences around the items that deserve the greatest protection, while permitting items of lesser sensitivity to be exported more readily when appropriate. To address the problems the task force identified, they recommended reforms in 4 key areas: licensing policies and procedures, control lists, information technology, and export enforcement. The President accepted the recommendations, and since early 2010, agencies have been working very hard to implement them. Much of the agency's efforts have centered on revising the U.S. munitions list and commerce control list. This reform will draw a bright line between the 2 lists using common terms and control parameters. This will help our exporters determine far more easily which list their products are on. The reform will ensure that those items of greatest concern to us from a national security and foreign policy perspective will remain on the USML and thus be subject to the most stringent licensing requirements, while items of less sensitivity will be moved to the CCL. I want to emphasize a key point. Items moving to the CCL are going to remain controlled. They're not being decontrolled, but in specific circumstances, they'll be eligible for export under Commerce's more flexible licensing mechanisms. I'm confident that the revised list will permit state to continue to perform its national security and foreign policy mandates in export licensing. I'd also like to note that we're making tremendous progress in the effort to rewrite the categories. We published 12 rebuilt USML categories in the Federal Register for public comment. The proposed rules for the 7 remaining categories have been drafted and are either undergoing or awaiting interagency review so that we can then publish them for public comment. On April 16, the Departments of State and Commerce published companion rules that implement the revised USML categories 8 aircraft and 19 engines. This is the first pair of series of final rules that put in place the rebuilt export control lists. Our goal is to publish the revised USML in its entirety on a rolling basis throughout this year. In the last phase of our reform effort, we'll need legislation to bring the initiative to its logical conclusion by creating a single licensing agency. The administration hasn't yet determined when to approach this effort, but we will fully engage our oversight committees and know we can count on your support when we do so. On that note, one final point I want to make is that this hasn't only been an interagency process, it's been a cross-government process. Over the course of the past 3 years, we've had the opportunity to work closely with the committee, with many others across the Congress on both the broad strategic questions of national security and the finer technical details of our proposals. Our work together shows what we can achieve together. I'm very grateful for your bipartisan support for this initiative and look forward to working closely with you on the remainder of the reform effort. With that, I want to thank you for inviting me to testify, and I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Commerce Assistant Secretary Kevin Wolf.
Chairman Royce, Congressman Sherman, members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the President's Export Control Reform Initiative. As both of you well said in your introductions, the Obama administration is in the midst of the most comprehensive effort to reform our export control system in history. It will significantly enhance the national security, foreign policy, and economic interest of the United States. It's taken unprecedented interagency cooperation, extensive consultation and discussion with Congress, and significant input from the public in order to bring about a reform of the Cold War era system that we have now. As best described in a speech that then Secretary of Defense Gates gave in April of 2010 on the subject, fundamentally reforming our export control system is necessary for national security. And what he meant by that is that our national security will be enhanced if our system allows for greater interoperability with our close allies. It reduces the current incentives in the system for foreign companies and allied countries to design out to avoid U.S. origin content, and allows the administration to focus its resources on more of the transactions of concern. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security plays a unique role in this process. We are the only U.S. government agency with trained staff focused on both the administration and the enforcement of export control laws. This includes also educating the public on the rules, performing engineering and regulatory analysis of actual and proposed rules for purposes of making licensing determinations and proposed changes, conducting enforcement analysis and investigations in order to help bring violators to justice. These technical skills, combined with the judgments of the Departments of Defense, Energy, and State to make decisions on licensing policy and applications for dual use and other items, and until now, a handful of less sensitive military items. In addition, BIS's law enforcement assets augment those of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute violators criminally and administratively, as well as to further inform the intelligence community on policy and enforcement-related activities. The export control effort that we're engaging in is a paradigm shift in how the U.S. government implements U.S. export controls. In the near term, as was just described, that shift entails the transfer of tens and thousands of less significant military items that don't warrant the controls of the U.S. munitions list to the more flexible controls of the Commerce Control List, a list that allows for both comprehensive embargoes and prohibitions, as well as more flexible license exceptions for trade with certain allies and other countries. Although all these changes can be made in accordance with the provisions of the notification provisions of Section 38F of the Arms Export Control Act and the new legislation pertaining to satellites, there are a number of authorizations that Congress could enact in the short term to enhance the effectiveness of U.S. export control system. Of course, when we move beyond rewriting the lists and merging them into one, legislation, as was just described, will be needed to establish a single list as well as a single licensing agency and a primary enforcement coordination agency, the three final pieces of the fundamental reform envisioned by the effort. We are committed to working closely with Congress when we approach this phase of the initiative. In 2010, Congress granted BIS permanent law enforcement authorities as part of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, CISADA. However, BIS's authorization for non-enforcement related ER activities under Section 109D of CISADA expires in 2013, later this year. We believe this authorization should be extended and that the confidentiality protections of Section 12C of the Export Administration Act should be made permanent. Additional resources would increase Commerce's operational efficiencies and activities. The President's fiscal year 2014 budget requests $8.2 million for additional resources to augment BIS enforcement capabilities. These include additional analysts, special agents, and 3 new export control officers, 2 of whom would be dedicated to conducting end-use checks in STA-eligible countries, with the 3rd expanding our regional footprint in the Middle East. Anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on this topic. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you have, and I now turn the floor over to my friend and colleague, DITSA Director Jim Hershey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Sherman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Defense's perspective on our work on export control reform. I'd like to highlight briefly why this initiative is of such great importance to our national security and therefore to the Department of Defense. The hard work by the Departments of Defense, State, Commerce, and other agencies has moved us closer to President Obama's vision of fundamentally reforming our export control system, a vision that has been supported by Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, and now Secretary Hagel. At the same time, we still have much work ahead to achieve a more transparent, flexible, efficient, and enforceable system based on the 4 singles of reform: a single control agency, working with a single control list on a unified IT system, and supported by coordinated enforcement activities. The Department of Defense remains committed to this effort because it will enhance our national security in several ways. First and foremost, the goal of our revised controls is to be clearer and better focused on protecting those items and technologies that give our warfighters a military edge. We should concentrate our efforts on the crown jewel technologies to support our forces and protect our investments. For other important items, we should be more willing to share with our allies and partners. Thus, the second reason for DoD support. In the new strategic environment, coupled with increasing fiscal constraints, we rely more heavily on allies and partners to take on more of the security burden. While the U.S. will maintain the capabilities to defeat any adversary anytime and anywhere, we will seldom go to war alone. This means it is in our national interest to equip our partners and increase their military capacity to meet mutual security needs. More flexible licensing requirements for certain items means that our allies will no longer have to wait for a license for an essential but militarily insignificant spare part, such as a hose or a switch. Of course, we do recognize that with increased flexibility and speed come compliance and enforcement needs. Accordingly, the administration has established new safeguards for these more flexible authorizations to mitigate risks. We will continue to have a policy of denial for items moved from the U.S. munitions list to the Commerce Control List 600 series, if destined to embargoed or sanctioned countries, including China, including the re-export of any 600 series item integrated into a foreign system. It is also important to note that export control reform will promote the health of our defense industrial base. It will help U.S. exporters, particularly our defense industry, to compete more effectively. This will in turn provide incentive for them to invest in advanced technologies that will enable the U.S. military to maintain its superiority in the future. The recent legislation which returned authority to determine the control of satellites and related items to the President, that was mentioned by both the Chairman and the Ranking Member, will be an example of how reform can provide an important boost to a very important segment of our industrial base. We are moving forward to meet the reporting requirements set forth in the legislation on that matter and to send the draft regulations out soon for public comment. Rewriting our controls is an important interim step towards a single control list and will allow us to spend much less time discussing commodity jurisdiction issues to determine whether an item should be controlled on one list or another. The technology, not the jurisdiction, should be our focus. Again, the Defense Department is committed to fundamental reform and strongly supports continued efforts to establish a single control list and a single control agency. Our national security will not be served if we stop halfway. We must ensure that we protect those few critical technologies that are critical to our U.S. military superiority and establish new export control mechanisms that best serve the national security objectives of this reform effort. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Well, the most immediate would come to mind is, as Mr. Sherman points out, we've had this dialogue for many years now. And when do you intend to submit legislative details of the proposal in terms of that new single licensing agency?
When we first have briefed this and in the task force report, we set up a three-phase plan to do fundamental export control reform. We are into phase 2 and working through that with the revised lists that we have published for public comment and will submit for congressional consideration through the 38F process. We believe we need to get further down the road with that before we submit legislation to enable that, and we will work closely with you when that time comes.
Well, the Export Administration Act is expired. So what you're using now for a number of years now is emergency authority to carry out the Commerce Department's basic licensing and enforcement activities. And hence the desire on our part either to work together with you in terms of updating and reauthorizing or replacing that expired act. One of the things I was going to ask you is the impact that the expiration may have had on enforcement efforts to combat illegal technology transfer. With you operating under emergency powers now and without us moving forward to actually reauthorize this act or replace it, or not having received the submission of your details for your proposal, has it had an impact on that?
With respect to the enforcement of the existing regulations, it's had no impact. There's a significant number of, over the years, civil and criminal actions that have been taken and maintained to the end under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. As I described in my testimony in a little bit more detail in my prepared remarks, there's a little bit more that can be done, but with respect to the ability to bring and maintain criminal and civil enforcement actions, it hasn't had an impact.
Let me ask you just for a minute, should we be able to get this proposal out there and get this done, what would it mean for U.S. exporters as a consequence? What's the payoff, if you could?
Are you referring
delineate
to the single enforcement agency?
You know, to get the single enforcement agency through to the finish line. What then would that?
The payoff for national security, we've just described very well on the panel, but with respect to exporters, the goal is a more efficient, more organized, more transparent system than what we have now.
Maybe in dollar terms, if you could quantify that for exporters.
Well, we don't have a dollar estimate with respect to the particular economic benefit, but in the end, it will result in a dramatically more efficient system.
That's our hope, and I think that's why we need to see the details of the proposal. I think there's one item that I've long been concerned about, and I guess I'll bring it up here, and that was Victor Boot's ability, frankly, his machinations around the globe to get his hands on the transfer of military equipment, and a lot went into bringing him to the bar of justice, you know, not only his capture, but getting him extradited here was something we were very involved in. So so we've got a situation where motivated by profit, and we have a situation where arms brokers search for ways to funnel arms to terrorist groups and to rebel groups. And many of the items being proposed to move from the munitions list to the commerce list have clear military value. To a guy like Boot, he'd be very focused on that. Presently, pre-export checks allow the government to identify risks of diversion or other illicit activities. With intelligence information gleaned from those checks, the U.S. government then stops U.S. companies from working with these shady brokers. That's been our experience. If you could explain the types of pre-export checks that military items moved to the commerce list will receive for companies seeking to export to the 36 destinations judged to be of low risk. I think once these goods get to Europe, that's going to be the test of your implementation, of your enforcement. I just wanted to get some feedback on that, Mr. Wolf.
Sure. With respect to the use of the license exception, strategic trade authorization, a condition is that all of the foreign parties have gone through the U.S. government licensing system before, so that they've been vetted effectively the same way that they would be vetted now. In addition, there's a limited number, a listed group of items, not all items, that would warrant it, and it's only for ultimate end use by the governments of those 36. To the extent those and a series of other notification and certification obligations can't be satisfied, then a license would be required even from the Commerce Department, even to that group of 36.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, China is clearly, or at least Chinese companies, sending technology to Iran. Some of that technology is American. Why haven't we designated China as a country of diversion concern and applied the measures called for by Title III of CISADA?
That's actually a State Department question.
Okay. Mr. Kelly.
I'm sorry, could I have the question again?
Oh, why haven't we designated China as a country of diversion concern and applied the measures called for in Title III of CISADA?
Okay, I'll take that question back. Thank you, sir.
Okay, we look forward to getting an answer for the record, Mr. Kelly. What?
I'm sorry. I'll provide it. I'll provide it now. For CISADA, ODNI is required to provide an annual report that identifies each country that the government in which the director believes, based on information available to the director, is allowing diversion of country of goods, services, and technologies described in the Act to Iranian end users. The report's classified, so we can't go into too much detail in this forum. But what I can say is that the report hasn't yet provided us with a case that would enable us to so designate China or any other country to date. Thank you.
Well, several Chinese companies have already been sanctioned, so you have the specifics, and we know how we're very reluctant to do anything that would upset our Chinese friends, and that may be the real reason, but I'm sure that the official State Department reason will be provided in greater depth for the record. As I said in my opening statement, one concern I have is that we will use this relaxation not to export goods, but to export tools, dyes, technology, and offshore production. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, where they hope that there is a comprehensive review of how the changes, including transfers of items to the CCL, will impact U.S. employment and suppliers. When we export technology rather than products, we lose the jobs, and we build the technological base of those not subject to the control of you three gentlemen. What steps are we taking so that we review the impact of moving a particular item from the State Department list to the Commerce list to see whether that will have the effect of allowing the export of blueprints, tools and dyes technology?
That's a very good question. As I said in my introduction, one of the national security justifications for the entire effort is to reduce the current incentives that exist in the system to design out to avoid U.S. origin content. As someone working in this area for over 20 years, I've seen this firsthand.
Mr. Wolf, I think you may need to rephrase the question. Many items have already been transferred to the commerce list.
Yes.
The effect of that is to make it easier to export export the technology and to do the production abroad. What has been done in this review process, moving an item from one list to the other, to see whether that will lead to the export of goods or whether that will lead to the export of technology? Mr. Kelly, do you have a response?
Sure, I would just say that you know, the whole rationale behind this reform effort is to enhance our national security, and an important part of that is our defense.
But if I were to just
base.
if I were at random to identify an item that's been moved from one list to the other, would you be able to assure me that that liberalization has the effect of making it easier to export goods and will not result or is not likely to result in the export of technology and the offshoring of production?
Well, sir, the basis for transferring from USML to CCL was asking the following question: does this item contribute to preserving U.S. military advantage? And that was the basis of our decision. And for items that are important to preserving U.S. military advantage, we've kept them on the USML.
I would hope you would add something else to your criteria, and that is the action you're about to take likely to lead to offshoring of production, the decline of the U.S. industrial base, the decline of U.S. jobs, and an increase in the industrial and technology base of other countries? If you leave that out of the decision-making process, what looks like an effort to enhance America's position will actually hurt it. I ask for unanimous consent to put this letter in the record.
Without objection, the letter from the Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, as well as the sanctioned companies mentioned in China, will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We go now to Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists for excellent testimony. I have consistently been supportive of making common sense improvements in our export control system, as long as it enhances our national security and proper procedures are in place to avoid our sensitive technologies from falling into the wrong hands. At a time when our economy is struggling, it's imperative that necessary reforms for our export control system are undertaken in order to help American businesses create jobs and grow our economy. Has the administration undertaken a detailed economic and regulatory analysis of the impact of these rules on small businesses before they're implemented? And if so, what were the results? Last Congress, I introduced the Export Administration Renewal Act, which would have allowed for the removal of the least sensitive items from the U.S. munitions list, because we can all agree that generic items like bolts, nuts, and wires, as you had testified, should not be regulated in the same manner as truly sensitive defense articles. Streamlining this process would provide U.S. manufacturers immediate benefits, while at the same time would allow for quick common sense reform, which we could also all agree on. That initiative could be implemented in a much timelier manner than some of the reforms set forth by the administration, while still ensuring that the effort is consistent with our national security interests. However, this is not the path that the administration has chosen. Instead, it has opted to act unilaterally in reforming export controls, and the scope of its agenda is so sweeping and so complex in its implementation that it raises several concerns. Two of my main concerns with the administration's approach have been enforcement and oversight. It has taken the administration several years now just to get to our current state. For example, the administration has proposed to transfer military end-use items, thousands of other sensitive components and parts, and even software code to the Commerce Munitions List under the Commerce Control List. Such a proposal may eliminate congressional notification requirements for the export or retransfer of such defense articles, and that is of grave concern to me because congressional notification must be kept. And this leaves these items eligible for a broad new license exemption to over 36 friendly countries, but it fails to include key safeguard measures such as end-use monitoring programs that could keep these items from falling into the wrong hands. So what protocols and safeguards are in place to ensure that third-party transfers, front companies, or foreign intelligence entities are not using these country exemptions for defense articles? This broad license exemption also raises the possibility of actually making it easier for regimes such as China, North Korea, and Iran to obtain U.S. parts and components related to fighter jets, tactical airlift, helicopters, tanks, and satellites that can pose an unintended threat to our national security. Given this reality, I'm concerned about the lack of government oversight over the military items that have been eliminated from both the U.S. munitions list and the Commerce Control List. As you are aware, the UAE, Singapore, and Malaysia, even China, have emerged as transshipment hubs for the export of commerce-controlled goods to Iran. Now that Commerce will also license munitions, what will the administration do to ensure that these items do not reach those irresponsible governments and do not end up in countries like Iran and North Korea? So thank you, gentlemen, for if you could answer in written form the questions that I have posed, but any comments you care to make now would be fine.
Sure, happy to, thank you. A whole series of questions, I'll try to touch on any of them. In the big picture, one of the primary goals of the effort is to allow us, in fact, to focus more of our resources, not so much on the transactions that are of less concern with respect to those for ultimate end use by the governments of the 36 countries that you mentioned, but with respect to the diversions and re-exports that are of concern. So in the main, that's at the core of what we're dealing with. With respect to the congressional notification question, we've written into our regulation that major defense equipment that would move, to the extent there is any, to the Commerce Control List would have congressional notification obligations attached to it.
Thank you, and I'll ask for
Sure.
the rest of the questions to be in written form, and I will give you the questions so you could respond.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Mr. Eni Falamavega
Thank you,
from
Mr.
American
Chairman.
Samoa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank members of the panel for their testimony this morning, and we deeply appreciate your services to our nation. I suppose the two fundamental principles underlying the whole question of export control system is one based on national security, and then on the other hand, export competitiveness. And it's my understanding we are currently the #1 exporter of military equipment in the world. Could you give me some idea how much, what's the dollar value of the amount of military equipment that we sell to the world at this point in time? I think 35 billion maybe, or maybe I'm overestimating.
Sir, I don't have the very latest number, but it's been in that neighborhood. So
Can you provide that for the record?
provide that.
And probably also the top 5 exporters of military equipment, I'd be very curious. I suppose China and
I
Russia
believe it's China, Russia,
and our
France,
European allies,
and
perhaps.
Israel, yes.
Okay. We currently have, what, 11 aircraft carriers? And you're talking about, which the bottom line is that understandably competitive is economically. What does this mean in terms of jobs for the American people? When you're looking at, say, we export 35 billion plus worth of military equipment, what does this mean in terms of jobs to our fellow Americans?
I don't have the numbers on that with me, but we can certainly
Can
get
you
it
provide
you.
that for the
Yeah.
record? Did we not just recently sign an agreement for selling some $10 billion worth of military equipment to our allies in the Middle East? I believe it was to Israel,
Yes.
Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Do you happen to have a listing in terms of exactly what are some of these toys that, that we
Well,
provide for our
I
allies.
believe those will all be notified by the Department of State at the appropriate time, sir.
And touching on the fact that it is in our national security's interest as well as economic competitiveness, do our European allies compete in this effort in selling this military equipment in the Middle East? France, maybe? Or?
Might I suggest, Mr. Kelly, that you hit the button?
Yes, sir. Congressman, the economic stakes indeed are vast. It's very important for U.S. companies all over the United States. Just last year, we had our best year in terms of defense sale exports ever. Just in the foreign military sales program that we administer, last year we had sales of approximately $70 billion, which is by far the most that we've ever achieved. So the trend line is in the right path. Our partners all over the world want U.S. equipment because it's the best military equipment that's available, and it hugely empowers us to work with our allies better in the battlefield as well, because we're all using the same equipment. I would just add that these sales create excellent, well-paying jobs all over the country, and so the stakes are very well. It's a great credit to U.S. companies, I think, that they've performed so well over the last couple of years, even as they continue to have to deal with the system that has developed in export controls over the past few years. It's the administration's estimation that once we get through this process, our defense exporters are going to be more competitive than ever.
More competitive than ever? Oh, okay. I have a different twist in terms of trying to understand the issues. You know, when our country was attacked by these 19 terrorists on September 11th, it's my understanding there were 16 federal agencies, all had subdivisions on intelligence. And the process of filtering information, and by the time we got to the president, a lot of cherry picking went into the process, and you get to wondering how accurate, how well are we monitoring the system so that we can get a sense of accuracy. Oh man, I only have 7 seconds left. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would love to follow up with some written questions on this end. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this very important hearing. On February 15, 2006, I chaired a hearing in this room, the first in the series on gross violations of global online freedom, especially in China, and on the selling and harmful transfer of weapons of mass surveillance to dictatorships, secret police that systematically employ torture, and repressive militaries. Representatives from Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Cisco testified, and it was further revealed at that hearing that Cisco had greatly enhanced the command and control capabilities of the secret police in China, enabling them to hunt down human rights activists, religious believers, and democracy activists as well. So since 2006, I've introduced the Global Online Freedom Act, endorsed by a virtual who's who of human rights organizations, from Freedom House to Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, Amnesty International, and Access, and 12 other human rights organizations, and by Yahoo, and others have shown a great deal of interest on the corporate side as well. The Global Online Freedom addresses what Eric Schmidt calls the dark side of the digital revolution. The bill would prohibit the export of hardware or software that can be used for surveillance, tracking, and blocking to the governments of internet-restricting countries. Current export control laws do not, as you know, take into account the human rights impact of these exports, and therefore do not create any incentive for U.S. companies to evaluate their role in assisting repressive regimes. The Global Online Freedom Act will not only help stop the sale of these items to repressive governments, but will create an important foreign policy stance for the United States that will help ensure that dissidents abroad know that we are on their side, tangibly and for real, and that the U.S. government, businesses, I should say, are not either wittingly or unwittingly profiting from this repression. This export control law is long overdue and thoroughly consistent with the approach Congress has taken, for example, in restricting certain exports for crime control equipment to the People's Republic of China. It seems to me it makes no sense for us to allow U.S. companies to sell technologies of repression to dictators or enable it, then turn around and have to spend millions of dollars to develop and deploy circumvention tools and other technologies to help protect dissidents. So my question is, I hope you have seen the bill. It's been around. We've pushed it for a long time. We've had many hearings on it. Are you in any position to offer a view as to whether or not you could support the Global Online Freedom Act and your thoughts on these weapons of mass surveillance? Again, they're modern tools used to hunt down dissidents and to jail them and to torture them.
Congressman Smith, first of all, thank you very much for your support for export control reform. I'm not at liberty to express an opinion on the bill. What I will say is that our arms transfer policy continues to be governed by our conventional arms transfer policy, which has been in effect for many years, more than a decade, and it requires us to consider a number of different factors as we decide whether to approve the export of conventional arms and defense-related exports, and those considerations include a host of foreign policy considerations that include human rights, intellectual property rights, and considerations like that.
I would ask you if you could, Mr. Wolf.
Yes, we haven't, as an administration, I believe, taken a position, but from the export control angle, it is a significant issue that we're spending a significant amount of time internally researching and thinking through without creating unintended consequences. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but I can guarantee that a significant amount of time is being spent internally trying to think through the very issues that you just set out from an export control perspective.
I certainly do appreciate that. If you could, H.R. 491, take a look at it, and if you can convey at least a view back to the committee for inclusion in our record, I would appreciate it.
Understood.
I thank you for that. And I yield back to balance. And Mr. Chairman, I do hope that our committee could take a good long look at this legislation as well and mark it up. I've been pushing it for 7 years. We got it out of subcommittee 1 year. There has been some opposition to it, but I think we were more than willing to work with the corporations to try to find a way that is very corporate friendly, but also human rights friendly. There is a way of threading that needle, and I think this legislation in its most current form does precisely that.
And we will take a look at that, Mr.
I appreciate
Smith.
it, Mr. Chairman.
And we go now to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel. I begin with a different premise than some of my friends. I actually believe we need to blow apart the current system. It doesn't work. I believe that the bottom line for us ought to be efficacy. If you can control sensitive information, great. But the facts are that the ubiquity of knowledge and technology today make that a very problematic proposition. And we are wasting time and we are damaging U.S. industry when we attempt to control something we can't. And the commercial satellite industry is a classic case study, where for a noble cause to deny a particular country sensitive technology, we handed over the industry to foreign competition. They got it anyhow, and we allowed an indigenous industry to grow up with a competitor, damaging jobs here and our industry here, and the goal was, in fact, foiled. Would that be a fair characterization in your opinion, Mr. Wolf?
No, I don't think so. I think because the rules do still have a very fundamental impact.
No, wait.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. My question is that a fair characterization about the commercial satellite industry?
Oh, well, as
Case
described
study.
in the report that both the Departments of Defense and State provided last year, yes, the controls that were imposed in the late 1990s had a significant negative impact on the U.S.
Thank
domestic
you.
satellite industry.
My staff's just handed out to you three so you can see it, because I know it's going to be hard. This is a flow chart of what you have to go through on the U.S. munitions list process for export practices. Is this an accurate depiction of the flow chart?
I think it's accurate to say that The status quo is very complex.
Very complex.
And that's why we're working so hard to try to reform it.
Well, I'm kind of stuck in the status quo for just a second before we get to what are we doing to try to improve it. So the current system is spread across 7 primary departments. Is that accurate? Somebody? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. There are 3 primary export licensing agencies. Is that correct?
Yes,
And there are 2 different lists.
at least.
And somebody, at least, and somebody has to make a qualitative decision, which list do I want to go under,
Correct.
both at your end and at the, say, the industry, the corporate end. Is that correct?
Correct.
Have any of you, I did, so in truth in advertising, any of you taken a test to see if you understand compliance requirements on export controls?
Sir, I practiced in this area for 20 years, so yes, many tests. And on
You've taken a test?
On a regular and daily basis, yes.
Okay, so you've been doing it for 20 years.
Yes.
But if you're sort of doing a lot of other things in a corporate world, this is not necessarily your expertise, but nonetheless, you have to pass a test to make sure you can show you understand the rules of engagement. Would you concede they're fairly complex and sometimes subjective?
Yes, they're complex, and we're trying to move away from that. And yes, they're subjective, and we're trying to move away from that as well.
Well,
with
tell
a
me,
straightforward list.
and I applaud that. I think you've really made some progress. But I guess what I want to hear is simplicity, clarity, and frankly, focus.
Right.
So it's not some Cold War, we're going to control everything because we can, when we know we can't. So what are we focusing on in the efforts you're making, which I do applaud. I think they're making progress. But what are you focused on? What is the ultimate achievement here in terms of what's doable? And are we going to continue to control things like rubber hoses and nuts and bolts that we know we can't control? And I'm not sure why we waste our time doing it.
Well, at the core of the effort is to spend dramatically less time and attention with respect to the less significant items to countries of less concern, primarily the group of 36 NATO and other close allies, so that we can focus our resources more on the transfers of more sensitive items for transfers to other countries. With respect to the complexity point, inevitably there will be some degree of complexity with any compliance regime. When you have it, it's extreme, either control everything always, everywhere, all the time, to controlling nothing anywhere, anytime. And when you try to lay out different degrees of control and sensitivity with respect to different items of different concern to different groups of countries, inevitably complexity results. But what we're trying to do with this effort is to try to make those rules more objective and standardized and common across those multiple regimes that you just referred to.
A laudable goal, and I urge you on in your efforts, but I plead with you, the bottom line should be efficacy. One might feel good about a whole bunch of rules and regulations to control X, but if you know that X is free-flowing and you can't control it, give it up. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership you personally have shown on this and so many of other vital issues. Let's not miss the bottom line in all this, or I should say the central issues and what's brought us together. It's that business companies, or international corporations, or even major American corporations, cannot be trusted to make economic decisions for their company and take into consideration the national security of our country. They can't be expected. The American people look at the business community and see people going to the country clubs and their churches, et cetera, and expect that maybe these people love their country so much that they wouldn't do something to make money that would hurt us and put us in jeopardy. That's just not the case, and we've seen it time and again. Businessmen are overwhelmed with the idea that their corporation has to have a 20% profit instead of a 10% profit, and if it means a little, putting us in jeopardy, America a little more in jeopardy, they'll do it in a heartbeat. One example of this could be the National Foreign Trade Council, which has long lobbied us against sanctions that we have placed on Iran and China and other adversaries to our country, that in its ratings last year, the National Foreign Trade Council gave those of us who voted for sanctions on Iran, no less, on Iran, we got a negative mark from them for voting for sanctions on Iran. Now, I'm sure my friend Mr. Connolly does not think that that was a bad vote. I am sure you were very supportive of our efforts against Iran. But we need to take into consideration that our business community does things like this. Another example, perhaps, is one we just heard discussed, was the satellites. I originally was supportive and got talked into the idea that our satellite manufacturers should have more freedom to deal with the Chinese. And I was assured by the administration at that time, the Clinton administration, that there would be so many protections that no transfer of technology would happen that I went ahead and supported it. Well, within a short period of time, we found out that all these safeguards amounted to nothing. As soon as we permitted it, the businesses moved forward as fast as they could. And what was the result? The result was long-range Chinese missiles were made much more reliable, so that they could, and then after our help, were MIRVed and could carry more than one payload. So they would hit more than one city if they decided to attack the United States. Well, we can't let that happen again. And let's note that the reason why it's taken so long for you to be here and us discussing this today is because for over a decade, the business community has refused to put countries that may be harmful to the United States and accept that they should be looked at differently than those countries like the democratic countries you deal with, Belgium, Brazil, whatever country. I am happy to see today that we indeed, as we shipped the satellite issue from the State Department munitions list over to the Commerce Department, that these new rules in the Commerce Department, you'll please correct me, Mr. Wolf, if I'm wrong, that there are, yes, there'll be fewer rules on our satellite industry, except for cases like China and Iran and other countries that are deemed potential adversaries of the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And let's not, minimize what you just said. It took us 10 years to get to that point because fair trade and free trade with all the rest of these countries was being held hostage by our business community so that they could deal with China and make a huge profit in dealing, short-term profit in dealing with China. I hope the last thing this country needs is to help China build an aerospace industry to compete with our aerospace industry. And so we need to make sure that our technology that's going over there isn't going to come back and hurt us, not only with military planes, but also put our people out of work, as Mr. Sherman outlined. Thank you very much for holding this hearing, and I appreciate your testimony today. And this is a very serious issue, and I can see that you guys have done your homework. Thank you.
Mr. Congressman, if I could just respond, one of the few items that is truly seared upon my memory from my experience in this position was sitting here 2 years ago and listening to you talk about China and satellites. And as you mentioned, we took very careful efforts in the 1248 report that was finally issued and in the legislation to take account of those. I think you'll find when you look at the regulations for what we have just finished notification to Congress on, that we've also taken very careful work on China and other prohibited countries. And I think you'll see that we have done a lot to do risk mitigation in that area.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you very much. As I say, you did your homework.
Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the panel. I am interested in receiving from you in written form because I want to focus on another area. But first, I want to acknowledge and applaud the administration's interagency effort to reform our export control system, which began with the President's Export Control Reform Initiative, with the goal of making it more efficient for all the parties and to eliminate duplication within the system. I think the implications for America's competitiveness and securing our national security interests around the world are obvious. I'm very interested. Some estimates say that tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of items will be transferred to the Commerce Control List. And so I'm interested to know how will the Department of Commerce decide if an item is eligible for a license exemption into one or more of the 36 friendly countries. Two, how will we ensure that the items that are going to this list are going to the correct government and not being diverted for some improper use, and what's the system for review of that and examination of it? And three, are there, as there are under the Arms Export Control Act, sufficient sanctions for a violation of that by improperly diverting materials or items by, for example, terminating future sales? So I'd like some detail on the kind of standard that's used, what the review process is to be sure that the end use is as described, and what's the sanction if there's a violation. But I'd like to use my time today to really focus on another area, and that is really advocacy. In my district in Rhode Island, as many of our defense companies are looking to expand their business, really to respond to declines in defense domestic spending, international sales are becoming even more important and really critical not only to the companies but to the job growth in my state. These are sales which are essential to maintain the positions they have, to grow jobs, and to maintain a steady flow of work throughout the supply chain, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. And I'd really like to encourage the administration to increase its efforts when appropriate to advocate for defense sales internationally. And I'm particularly interested, Mr. Wolf, in understanding what you understand to be the timeline. My understanding is the Department of Commerce has the responsibility of approving advocacy for defense sales. What is the current time period under which that occurs, and whether or not, first of all, what's the average time for approving requests for advocacy of defense sales? And also, do you anticipate as a result of sequestration whether or not that will have some impact on this, because very often this time is critical to a company? And then, Mr. Kelly, I would like to ask you, from where you sit, are there recommendations that you can make for improving the process to advocate specifically for defense sales? This is important to my district, important to Rhode Island's economy, and while I want the review to be done properly, I'm anxious to know how we might accelerate that process in the appropriate circumstances.
Sure. With respect to the defense trade advocacy, that's another part of the Commerce Department, and I'll have to get back to you with respect to what the actual timelines are on that topic. With respect to the second question, I think it was directed at Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm very happy to respond to that issue. I think all of us at the State Department, indeed all through government, understand the critical importance of advocacy on behalf of our defense producers and exporters. And I will say, as somebody who's been involved in this in the field for many decades now, back in Washington, the Political Military Bureau, that it is an issue that has the attention of every top-level official who's working on foreign policy throughout the government, including the top officials at the State Department certainly are engaged in talking to our partners, especially from the countries that are our biggest customers, in advocating on behalf of our companies and doing everything we can to make sure that these sales go through. Again, taking into consideration all of the other factors that we're required to consider in the conventional arms transfer policy. At the same time, many of us, not just in the State Department, but across government, try to participate in defense sales shows all over the world. I recently traveled to the UAE, where I participated in the biggest defense sales conference in that region, and had bilaterals with a dozen countries where I pressed for them to buy American. And that is something that we're doing every day on basically every continent in the world, and we take it very, very seriously, and we're constantly thinking of how we can do better. But some of the issues that are critically important to our competitiveness relate to structural issues like the export control regime, and that's why we've spent thousands of man-hours and lots of consultations with this committee and with others in trying to enhance our system so that our defense industry is going to become even more competitive than they are already. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
We go to Mr. Shabbat, Steve Shabbat from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in November of 2010, the U.S. committed to support India's full membership in the 4 multilateral export control regimes: the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Australia Group for Chemical and Biological Controls, and the Wassenaar Arrangement, which was for dual use and conventional arms control in a phased manner. For its part, the government of India committed to take steps towards the full adoption of the regime's export control requirements. What progress has been made by India and the United States in advancing this important matter?
Okay, thank you for your question, Congressman. We're working very closely with India on a number of different issues, including on these 4 regimes. They're working intensively on their adherence to all of these regimes. We are working and collaborating with them. We think it's very important that India be brought on and participate in these. We think that it's going to enhance the international strength of all of these regimes, and it's a high priority for us. I would just add that we're engaged with India in intensive conversations on a whole range of defense issues. I just traveled to India recently. It's my 2nd trip in the past year with a Department of Defense delegation in which we engaged with our Indian friends in talking about how we can bring our defense relationship to another level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The new Secretary of State was in before this committee about a week ago, and he had a lot of questions. There were so many things going on. I raised an issue, but he really didn't have the time to answer it to any degree, so I'd like to raise it again. It's been more than a decade since President Bush, back in 2001, announced that Washington was willing to sell Taiwan 8 diesel-electric submarines at a cost of about $12 billion US. The official position of Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense is that it remains committed to procuring those submarines from the U.S. Of course, the U.S. stopped making diesel submarines quite some time ago, so the sale has been stalled, and we worked with some of our European partners on this issue as well, and that hasn't come to anything yet. Could you advise what the current status of those submarines are, and whether the administration is planning to get this moving again? I'm the chair of the Asian Pacific Committee. I'm going to be in Asia next week, in Taiwan and Korea and in Japan as well. So I'm sure that the Taiwanese are going to raise this issue, and I'd like to have an answer for them. So.
Yes, sir. If I may, I'd like to take that back, and we'll give you an update. I will say that as is consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, we're in constant communication with Taiwan about their defense requirements, and that dialogue continues and is vigorous.
Okay, thank you very much. And then finally, and if you could get us some additional information before Saturday, it would be particularly helpful, because that's when we're leaving. And if it's a little later than that, if you can get it to my office, they can get it back to me. I'll tell you what, instead of asking a third question, which is going to take some time, I think, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back at this time.
I thank you, Mr. Shabbat. We'll go now to Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on the questions I think the Chairman asked originally, and Congressman Sherman asked as well. The fact sheet that we had received says that these reforms will make it harder for countries like Iran to acquire arms, but it doesn't really explain why. And what I'm trying to understand is, if we know that the Iranians, for example, and other countries are actively seeking to acquire U.S. arms, defense items, technology, manufacturing equipment, et cetera, and we have a reform proposal that transfers defense items from the munitions list to the commerce control list. What impact does that transfer have, and why does it make it harder and not easier for them ultimately to acquire those sorts of arms?
Thank you. Very good question. There are two primary ways. One, the Commerce Department is adding its enforcement and investigative resources into the mix with respect to such items. So we're taking the status quo of all of the law enforcement and intelligence resources and adding more to it, and that's in one way. And the second way goes to the fundamental nature of the reform effort, is that we would be spending less of our time with respect to trade for ultimate end use by governments of NATO plus countries and taking more of those resources that we spend today monitoring and licensing and approving and reviewing those items and diverting them toward enforcement and follow-up on the transactions of concern that you just mentioned.
Okay, let me actually use that as a jumping off point then to talk about the way things work today, not in the enforcement area. Let's talk about export control agents for a second. Mr. Wolf, that's your area as well. For those of us who don't think about these issues every day, tell me what an export control agent does.
It's all the same things another law enforcement officer does in terms of investigating, following up on leads, reviewing intelligence, and then participating in the prosecution of those that have violated U.S. export control.
Right. And where are our export control agents outside of this country?
There are 7 outside the United States.
And where are they?
Just a moment, I have that list.
And I ask, as you look, I ask because at a hearing we had 2 years ago, I asked a question and was told then that we had, well, I'll let you tell me the numbers, but I was particularly concerned about the numbers that we had in the UAE and in China. Very sensitive areas, very few export control agents.
Well, in addition to the resources that we would have working through our embassies.
But how many do we have, though?
We have in the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Russia, and 2 in China.
2 in China, 1 in each of those other places.
Correct.
And then getting back to my original question, here's my concern. We have 2 export control agents in all of China.
Yes.
Right? We have 1 in the UAE. And we're making this pretty significant change under this reform proposal, which you've, if I understood correctly, assured us is going to not make it easier for countries like Iran to acquire U.S. arms because we'll have more resources to commit to enforcement?
We're adding those resources plus all of the other resources, the Commerce Department, on top of that which exists today, such as ICE, FBI, Homeland Security, which are spread out in 140 other countries. So it's not the only of those 7 people that are responsible for maintaining the enforcement and the investigation.
Okay. Can you just tell me that? So how does the export, we're not going to have enough time to do this in detail, but just generally the export control agent, the role that person plays is what at the outset? And when would any of those other agencies come into play?
Those agents are dedicated full-time to nothing but export controls. They will facilitate coordination with ICE, FBI, Homeland Security, and other resources around the world in order to be able to monitor, follow up, do post-shipment verifications, do blue lantern checks, do a variety of audits of where items are going after they've been shipped. The advantage of these people being added to the mix is that they're focused 100% of the time on the export control topic.
Right. Who are we adding? Who are we adding?
We are adding the Commerce Department's export enforcement authorities on top of those that already exist with respect to the current system.
Okay, so my goal, like yours, one of the goals here, I think, or certainly part of the overall goal we're trying to achieve is to ensure that we do everything we can to prevent U.S. arms from flowing into the hands of those, into those countries where they don't belong and we don't want them. Shouldn't part of this discussion include an increase in the number of export control agents? Won't that make this easier? Instead of saying they're going to be able to continue to work with all these other agencies, they're the only ones doing this full time. And as we make this major change, shouldn't part of that also require an increase in the number of those export control agents?
Indeed. In fact, in the President's FY14 budget, we've asked for an increase in the number of agents for many of the same reasons that you
How many?
three.
Okay. And where are you asking that they be placed?
Turkey, Europe, and another one in the United Arab Emirates.
Okay. If we could, we'll talk after, and if you could just think about how, particularly in China, if this reform were to be enacted, how those two export control agents will have enough time to do what they do every day already and coordinate all of their activities with all of these other agencies. Perhaps we can follow up in my office on that. And I appreciate it. Yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gosh, I've got a lot of questions for you guys. I don't know who to aim them at. That might be a bad term, and we're talking about weaponry. Aim. How many licensed exporters are there? Would you guess? Mr. Wolf, maybe?
Well, in terms of numbers of licenses I can give you, there were over 80,000 licenses processed by the State Department last year and approximately 25,000 individual licenses from the Commerce Department. In terms of how many individual companies there were,
13,000.
13,000. What is the process if a licensee develops a new super weapon? What is the process whereby we get notified that this weapon we want to maintain control over and we don't want it to export? How did we get that notification?
Well, when the exporter, it depends a little bit where the weapon you're talking about is coming from. If it's something that the industry has developed on their own, then they look at the lists, determine where on the list it falls, and tell us that they're going to export. If it's something they've developed in coordination with the Department of Defense, then we are likely aware of it in other ways. So.
Okay, so you're already going to know. Is it a problem for patent rights and proprietary information that they have to come to you and tell you that they're thinking about developing this, especially if it's not with the Department of Defense?
We're very, very careful when we deal with individual companies, and I believe that's true across the government, to make sure that we protect their proprietary information when it's identified to us as such.
Okay. Are there ways of tracking? In other words, if a licensee, an exporter, sends an export to a country that's prohibited, how do you track that?
well, one, if it's prohibited, such as with respect to 600 series items destined to China, a license wouldn't have been granted in the first place, so by definition it would have been illegal. And then we use all the standard investigative tools in terms of intelligence resources, tips from other countries, tips from companies, follow-on checks, post-shipment verifications. There's a wide range of methods in order to be able to identify whether an item is being transshipped from one country to another in violation of U.S. export
What's the
control law.
most recent example you would give us?
There was a very large action taken with respect to a company operating out of Texas, which is a pending matter that the Justice Department has described at a press release and series of indictments of transferring items that required authorization to ship from the United States through a variety of different sources around the world into Russia, all activities which required a license and didn't exist. And that was we can provide you more information about it, but it was a rather substantial interagency exercise to monitor and track and follow up on illegal transfers.
What's the penalty for that?
There are both administrative penalties in terms of debarment, the inability to do business, the inability to ship from the United States, in addition to criminal penalties, up to 10 years in jail, and significant dollar penalties as well. The dollar and the criminal penalties, by the way, have been harmonized between the State Department and the Commerce Department.
Of course, you could argue the damage was already done because they already have that technology.
Understood, but the point of the threat of prosecution is to be able to compel compliance and to stop that once it is discovered and once it does begin to occur.
Okay. When that happens, and forgive me, these are probably
questions that you guys know, and I don't have a clue on. When somebody sells technology abroad, whether it's to Russia or China, whoever, do they service that equipment? Do they do follow-up service on it?
Generally, it's not uncommon, and with respect to the way the State Department and the Commerce Department rules, the regular follow-on transfer of technology, or in the State Department's case, services, requires authorization as well.
Okay, so y'all get notified of that. You're supposed to get notified of that. Let me rephrase that. Is that right?
Generally, yes.
Okay. When someone sells equipment or technology in violation of our rules, is there such a thing as a slap on the wrist and just say, don't do it anymore? It was very, very low level, and you get notice that you're going to be taken off, you're going to lose your license?
Yes, there's a wide, both the Commerce Department and the State Department have a wide range of particular penalties, anywhere from a warning letter to a requirement for an audit to dollar penalties to suspension and debarment, all the way up to incarceration.
Okay, so you have a list of those violations going how far back?
As far as our records indicate, there's a significant list going back, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We want to thank our witnesses for their time this morning, and this is a critical issue in terms of both our economy, growing the economy, and at the same time protecting national security. So we'll be following the administration's progress on this, and we look forward to collaborating closely with you as we move forward. I thank the members. I thank the witnesses again. We stand adjourned.